Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is talk about what do you learn next. So I'm assuming that you are a newer web developer in that you've learned the MERN Stack. So what is the MERN Stack? That means you've learned how to use Mongo as your database, okay? So Mongo as your database, Express as your backend web framework, and React as your front-end framework. Okay, all very popular tools, great place to start building your foundation as a web developer because they're generally in-demand things to know. Okay, so if you got a nice good foundation React, a nice good foundation with MongoDB, and a nice foundation with Express, where do you go from there? Okay, there's a lot of places to go. Now, first, let's just focus on sort of how can I go deeper in these three technologies. Now, particularly in React, there's a whole universe of technology to learn once you know how to use React. Okay, one of the first things you probably would like to learn is Redux. Okay, now Redux is a state manager. Now, while you can now kind of do the same thing in React using the use context and use reducer hook, if you're looking for work, chances are one of the companies you'll work for, if you're working in React, will probably be using Redux in their application. So being familiar with sort of the way Redux works proper is not a bad thing to know, even though you can replicate very similar patterns with a lot of the newer hooks in React to manage your state. Okay, so that's a good library to learn. Okay, other things that are really good to learn in the React world is Next.js. Okay, now Next.js is a very interesting because it kind of is like a little back end, a little front end. It's mostly front end. It allows you to build a front end application, but allows you to do certain aspects of building your front end application from the server side. Okay, so it allows you to do three things. You can have your normal single page application where the website's being rendered in the browser when the user sees it. You can have server-side rendered pages, which are rendered before, so it's rendered at the request time. So user makes a request, server renders the page, then sends back the final application. And you can have static pages, where you, at some prior point, you pre-render the app, so they're just static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript pages, which is the fastest, most secure thing you can do. And the cool thing about Next.js is that you build your React application, and you don't necessarily have to sit there and think about which one it is. Based on how you code your application, it'll figure out which parts of your application should be static, which ones shouldn't be, which should be server-side rendered, and you get sort of an optimized application. Okay, that does all the things. Okay, so Next.js is a really powerful framework to learn. Okay, when it comes to developing a web application. But if you really like the idea of a statically generated website, then there's Gatsby, which is also in the React averse. Okay, and Gatsby is specifically static generated pages. What it does is it kind of takes what Next.js does, can render static pages, but what it also does, it creates a plugin sort of interface to grab data from different sources. So essentially what you do is using different Gatsby plugins, you can configure different sources of data, and then you can sort and grab that data using GraphQL. And then you just feed that in throughout your application. So instead of having like different fetch calls and different fetches of information all across your app, you just kind of centralize the collection of all that information through your plugins, and then you just splash queries of that information throughout your app and use the data. And then it generates a static application on the other side. Actually, if you've seen my blog, toots.alexmercedcoder.com, this is a Gatsby blog. This is created with Gatsby. So technically, these are all just standard HTML, CSS pages that are rendered every time I make a new blog post. So every time I make a new blog post, that entire blog gets rendered again. Okay, so that's one thing. And then there's React Native, which is for building mobile applications. Okay, and you can basically use your React skills to build mobile applications with React Native. So there's a lot of room on how to expand your skills just within the world of React. Plus, there's like a lot of libraries like Formic and other kind of component libraries, like getting better with like the Bootstrap React or any of the variety of different component libraries, Material UI for React, etc. So you can spend a lot of time really kind of diving into the Reactiverse. Another thing you could do is you can learn another front-end framework. My personal opinion, sort of the next easiest thing to learn, and that also has room for, your job hunt, is Vue. Okay, so you can learn Vue. Now I think they're just about to release Vue 3. I think they kind of half released it. So I would recommend trying to learn the newest version of Vue, Vue 3, which has some minor differences. But Vue is a pretty good framework, and it's kind of easy to pick up. And it also has a huge universe of technology. So kind of like React has Redux, Vue has Vuex. Okay, so Vuex would be what you would use if you wanted to do like state management in Vuex, so that kind of application level state. So in the same way you'd want to learn Redux for React, you'd want to learn Vuex for Vue. On top of that, in the same way that React has Next.js, Vue has Nux.js, which does the same thing. It does the static, the dynamic rendering, all that stuff, just using Vue instead. And if you wanted to do like static site generation like Gatsby, and you wanted that in Vue, there is Gritsum, which is like the same thing, but in Vue. Okay, so you really do have this sort of whole universe in each of these frameworks. And then if you wanted to do mobile apps in Vue, you would just learn NativeScript. NativeScript allows you to use pretty much any other JavaScript framework to build apps, and it has templates that already exist for using Vue and Angular, which Angular will be the next framework we'll talk about, which is probably the hardest to learn. But when it comes to jobs, it probably has the second highest number of jobs available next to React. And even though it doesn't have as many job openings as necessarily React does, I think at this juncture, and then here's the thing you always have to keep in mind, it's not just the number of jobs, it's also the number of applicants. Okay, so sometimes technologies that have a smaller number of jobs available are still actually easier to apply for because there's less people applying for them. So I remember like there was this survey that said like people who were applying for jobs that code in like the Go programming language got more interviews because there was less people applying to the jobs that were available. Okay, so even though there's less Angular jobs or less Vue jobs, they are not, most places that are training web developers are focusing on React. So these can provide sort of ins in sort of smaller applicant pools. So you have like a little bit less competition jobs, although there are still boot camps that teach Angular as well. So Angular and React both have like a lot of boot camps that focus on them. Vue, Svelte, not so much. So those can provide sort of like little backdoors into certain job markets or parts of the job market. Okay, but Angular is another one. Angular kind of has everything wrapped in it. So literally you could just be spending time learning this for quite a while and learning all the ins and outs of it. A lot of the stuff that you see kind of done in separate libraries in Vue and React is all kind of really just bundled into Angular. Although there are a couple libraries like Angular Universal, which is what it does like, it's kind of like the Next.js, but again, it's still part of the Angular. Everything is done by Google for Angular, so you don't have to kind of like go outside of the Googleverse. But yeah, you can do everything with Angular. Then there's Svelte. Svelte's like the newest game in town, and Svelte's been pretty aggressive about creating its own little universe. And even actually, before I do that, I should probably mention NGRX. NGRX is sort of Angular's equivalent of Redux. So if you're in Angular, this would be sort of like the next library you learn, NGRX. So you can do like Redux stuff like that in Angular. Now let's go back to Svelte. Svelte is a really easy to learn. Like this is ridiculously easy to learn. Does everything like React, Vue, and Angular does. Actually results in smaller bundles. It's basically the only downside to it is that it's just so new that there aren't really many jobs and many applications that are using it yet, but it is awesome. And they've really been aggressive at building out their universe. So you have like Sapper, which is like their version of like Next and Nux.js. So Svelte, Sapper. Okay, so you have Sapper, which is their sort of, again, version like that generates like the static site generation, all that kind of stuff. They have Svelte native, which is just which uses native script, as I mentioned earlier, but they built their own template in native script, so that way you can use Svelte to make mobile applications. So you can make mobile applications in Svelte too. Okay, so you have a nice little universe of stuff to use there. Okay, if you wanted to go that route. And okay, if you really want to play like a long play, thinking that Svelte will keep growing as it has. Other useful technologies are things like Stencil.js. Probably you won't find specifically jobs in Stencil.js, but it's a cool tool for you to create components no matter what framework you work in. So whether it's React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, you can create components in Stencil.js and then use them in those things. And actually the more important thing to learn, I guess, as far as job-wise goes, Stencil is created by Ionic. And then Ionic has like this whole Ionic ecosystem of components that can be used across the different frameworks for creating mobile applications. So learning about the Ionic framework and how it works is also a pretty useful thing to do. Okay, so Ionic is another cool topic. Okay, now, cool. So that's like the front end. So there's a lot you can do there on the front end, and that's just like at the highest level. There's still a lot of small libraries, so you can learn different animation libraries. So if I were to look up JavaScript animation libraries, okay, I can, you can find lots of tools for you to use. So like here we go, like 3JS, Anime.js, Mo.js, Velocity. You can find all sorts of really cool libraries to give yourself visual flair. Okay, and learning CSS libraries, getting better with CSS, getting better with Sass, learning what less is and stylus. These are all things that can help you make styling easier for yourself. Okay, but that's the front end. Now let's go to the back end. So you are using JavaScript to start out with, right? So what you could do is you could learn another backend framework. There are backend frameworks that allow you to have more tools than just like allowing you like building everything yourself in Express. So this could be something like a Sails. Okay, this is I think it was like trying to be like the Rails of JavaScript. So that's one option. There's two frameworks that use TypeScript. So TypeScript, which is another thing worth learning, it's like a superset of JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, you pretty much know TypeScript. It just has some little extra nuances. I have playlists on that. You can find playlists on almost all this stuff over there at my website, devnursery.com. So pretty much anything you'd want to learn, you just go here, click on video tutorials, and just scroll through all the things that you can possibly learn. Okay. So Sails, but the two ones that use TypeScript are Nest.js, which is like, that's the one that's kind of like, it's very similar to Angular on the front end. So in that case, like Google's been like, yeah, this is a pretty nice like magical pair if you pair Angular with Nest.js. Although Nest.js could be used with any framework because it's a backend framework, it creates an API. But if you like the Angular workflow, it tends to give you a very similar workflow. So if you like that, that's a good framework. Then there's Full.ts, whose workflow kind of reminds me it's a little Java-esque. So you probably haven't used Java Spring before, but if you use this and then you were ever to learn Java and Java Spring, which is another thing I'm going to recommend to learn, this kind of gives you a feel without necessarily having to go learn the new language first. So you might want to go learn this first and then go learn Java and then learn Java Spring. And on that, there is a lot of jobs in Java and Java Spring. But keep in mind, there's also a lot of Java developers because Java's been around for a while. So that's always thing you have to keep in mind. Just because there's a lot of jobs, you also think about who is sort of like the other people competing with this stuff. So the older the language, the more developers that language is going to have that have 5, 10, 15 years of experience versus sort of the more newer technologies aren't like something that became big like GraphQL. You're not going to find someone who has 10 years of experience in GraphQL. You're not going to find someone who really has 10 years of experience in React. These things haven't really been around quite that long. Let me just actually see here. React. Created year. 2013, yeah. So no one has 10 years worth of experience in React, which means definitely no one has 10 years of experience in Vue or 10 years experience in Svelte. So there you're in a much more even playing field, even though the number of jobs are maybe not as much as, let's say, Java or C++. Okay, but you are there competing against people with 15 years of experience in those areas. So again, when you're thinking about where to focus your search, it's not just the number of search results you get on LinkedIn, but also again, who do you think you're competing with? Okay, and how well do you think you can compete with them? Like, have you built your brand? Have you built, and do you feel like you've gotten yourself to where you need to compete with them? Apply anyways. Always apply. But again, think critically and strategically about how you focus your efforts. The riches are in the niches. Okay, sometimes those niche technologies that maybe only have like 10 job ads. Well, those are the 10 job ads that will definitely give you a call back because no one else is applying for them, because a lot of older developers who already kind of have their niche don't want to go learn something new. They're already happy with their space. There's already enough jobs in their space. They got plenty of experience. So in that case, that's an opportunity for you. Okay. Also, the other way you can go about this is learning another language. So like Java with the Spring framework is one example, but there's also newer languages like Go. Okay. I personally really enjoy Golang. I think it's a really fun language. But again, if we're talking about web development, because that's what I'm focusing on in this video, then you're going to want to learn the Buffalo framework. The Buffalo framework is kind of like Go's version of Ruby on Rails. Oops. Buffalo Go. Okay. So you can learn the Buffalo framework. Or maybe you want to learn Rust. Okay. Rust is another really cool new language from Mozilla that a lot of people like for doing really, like Go and Rust. The reason they exist is because people want to create fast applications that normally you would have to do in C++. But C++, you know, since then we've come up with a lot of sort of better syntactical tools and styles, but there really wasn't like a new lower level language like that to make fast applications. So Rust and Go kind of offer some of these like newer ways of doing things. Also clean up a lot of the ways you do things in C++ that people didn't like, or adapt some of the new sort of technologies and whatnot, but still give you that sort of more low level, faster API. And again, that means more work. These are more verbose. So if your JavaScript is what's called higher level, so it's easier to learn. It's a lot less typing. Same thing with Ruby and Python. So for most applications, that's fine because honestly, most computers are fast enough to run most things. But if you're making like very hyper 3D intensive games or operating systems, or you're building an API that's going to serve so much data that you really need to be super, super, super fast, Rust, Go, C++, Java, like that's what they're going to want. So Rust and Go are a cool place to be. Okay, now Rust is a cool language, but their framework, I always forget. I think it's like Rocket or Phoenix or something. Rust web framework, yeah, Rocket. Okay, would be like the web framework you would learn to work with Rust. Okay, and you would build an API with Rust instead of Express. Okay, so you can learn a new language and learn their web framework. Or if you want to go learn Python, you have a couple different choices. Okay, Python's a very easy language to learn. And there's a lot of jobs in Python in different areas, not just web development. It's actually primarily like data science, data analytics, but there's also machine learning, automation, marketing automation. Literally you can do anything with Python. Okay, and Python's just super used. Blockchain is used all over the place. So Python's a great, phenomenal language to learn. And its web frameworks. It has mainly Django and Flask, but let's take a look at some of the whole bunch. Okay, web frameworks. Django is the big one. Flask is sort of the second big one, which is actually this one right here. Let's see here. Let's go for where the list is. Where's the list? It doesn't really give us a list. Just links to lists. Here we go. And see there's other ones other than just Django and Flask, like Sanix, Starlet. People are constantly making new. I've heard really good things about Masonite. Actually, I'm going to bookmark this. I think I have a Python section to my bookmarks. Deployment, HTML, CSS, Python. There we go. Okay, but Django will probably be the first step because that's going to be where most of your Python jobs are at. Django. Blah. Nope. Django framework. Django, which is it's kind of one of the weirdest web frameworks. So even if you learn like Ruby on Rails and Buffalo, like Django really has its own really really unique way of doing things. Um, it was actually my first web framework. Like I learned that before I learned any other web framework. Um, and I think after I've learned other frameworks, I've grown to like it less. I'm definitely more now a fan of like minimalist frameworks like Express, and in Python Flask, or in Ruby it's Sinatra, where you build everything from kind of from scratch. I just like the flexibility. I like knowing how everything is connected, um, and being able to kind of really kind of make things work my way. But that takes a lot longer. Things like Django, Ruby on Rails, Buffalo, they really kind of allow you to do things really quick because they do a lot of the basic work for you. But Django definitely has a sort of a very unique way of doing things. So this one would take a while to learn. It's definitely worth learning. Companies like Instagram use it. Um, Flask is the other big one. I like Flask a lot. It's a lot more like Express. So if you liked Express, this is going to feel right at home. It's the second biggest one, so there are jobs in Flask. Then there's a lot of little mini ones that exist, but I don't know how big the job markets in those are. Okay. Then if we go to Ruby, it's Rails, Rails, Rails. Everything's all the jobs are really Ruby on Rails. And Ruby on Rails has a lot to learn. You can spend a while kind of learning all the nooks and crannies of Rails. Although once you get the basics, you can do a lot really quick. Like you can really just spin up a backend application. You've seen videos of mine where I create an API with authentication like less than 20 minutes with Ruby on Rails. It's pretty awesome. Which is sort of the main reason to learn Ruby, because like that's Ruby jobs are primarily that. Like you can do other things with Ruby, but generally other things end up being done in Python. So generally, Ruby jobs are always Rails jobs. They're almost synonymous in the job market. Although you might find jobs in like Sinatra. Sinatra is the sort of the Flask. Well, not Frank Sinatra. Uh, it's like the Flask or the Express of Ruby, and it makes Express look like you're typing a lot, or like to get the basics done. Like it makes it's pretty minimalist. I like it. I definitely like Sinatra. You can get something going pretty quick. If you just need to get like a basic hello world, like that's literally it. Like these few lines of code, you have a hello world uh, um, web server. That's all it takes. It's pretty cool. Cool. Other languages. PHP is always a great language to learn. Okay, the reason why, even though like you'll hear a lot of people sort of slam PHP, it's PHP has come a long way since the old days. Like a lot of times people have like a negative view of PHP because it's such an old language, and then people associate it with like WordPress, which WordPress is actually is a cool thing. WordPress is probably powers more than half the websites on the internet. So PHP is literally probably the most proliferated language on the net next to like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because most websites are using something like a CSS, a WordPress, a Drupal, one of these CMSs, content management systems, and they're all built in PHP. But people always kind of associate that sort of style of web design with PHP, but PHP is a powerful language in itself, which you can do anything with. And PHP has really added a lot of new syntax over the years. Like you have arrow functions there, spread operator, a lot of really, really cool stuff that you can really do really modern syntaxes in PHP. But more than anything, it's added its own really cool framework, Laravel. Okay, PHP has a lot of web frameworks just like everybody else, but Laravel is sort of like the cream of the crop. It's their Ruby on Rails. And what happened is a lot of PHP developers were learning Ruby to use Rails, but now a lot of them are like, well, now we have a framework that's kind of like Rails, offers all that really nice features to get stuff done quickly. And people are moving over to Laravel, which is really cool, and has a lot of really nice tools to get stuff done pretty quick. I definitely really enjoy Laravel. Although getting it initially set up can be a little bit tricky, at least my two experiences of installing Laravel and PHP on a freshly refreshed laptop. Both required a little bit of troubleshooting, but once it was set up, worked wonderfully. But I find the same situation with Ruby and Ruby on Rails. Generally, there's always a little tinkering I have to do at first, but once I get it up and running, it's up and running. So those would be some of the main areas on the back end. There's also just enhancing what you already do on the back end. So going back to Express, learning things like authentication. Okay, learning things like how to use different SQL databases. So most of these frameworks like Laravel, like Ruby on Rails, like Django, they have built in what's called an ORM to connect to SQL databases. But like in Express, you would get to choose your own ORM. So you'd have to go look at through the different ORMs in over there at npm and see which one you want to use. Because again, Express is minimalist. It doesn't tell you what ORM to use. It's your thing. Okay. All Express does is allow you to make routes. Same thing with Flask. Same thing with Sinatra and Ruby. You decide how to handle the database part. So that's called an ORM, Object Relationship Manager. Sequelize is probably the most popular one in the Node universe. There's Bookshelf, and Waterline. I haven't used either of those. I've used Objection. That's generally what my go-to because I generally use Next Query Builder. There's TypeORM. I have used that because that generally is used with Nest.js and FolTS because that one has TypeScript set up or it has like the best TypeScript compatibility. And there's other ones. You know, I've been tempted to make my own ORM one of these days. It's all it is really it just connects. It's an abstraction over the base drivers of that SQL database that just creates an object with a bunch of functions for you to do basic queries. You know, and to build your project from. That's essentially what it does. Cool. So you can learn that. I'm trying to think if there's any other low-hanging fruit. Then you can always just learn more about different browser APIs, such as IndexedDB. IndexedDB is not a separate library. It's actually something built into the browser, but it's like a little mini database, a little bit more higher level than like using local storage or session storage. It allows you to do a little bit more crazier stuff. This is used in a lot of like mobile applications, progressive web applications, which is also like really cool. So this is a cool thing to learn. Honestly, you can just spend days just going to MDN and just exploring, all the browser APIs and JavaScript features here and have endless things to learn. I do enjoy doing that. Just literally just going from page to page and just trying out the different things that I find. But IndexedDB, service workers, learning how to do service workers and how to use those. Okay. So here's like a Google explanation of what a service worker is, but it allows you to kind of allow you to make your web apps to run offline and things like that. So here's like the service worker API at MDN. Okay, like those are two really big concepts, and progressive web apps as a category is becoming a bigger trend because people don't necessarily always want to have to upload everything to the mobile app store. And because what a progressive web app is a web application that works like a mobile app, but out of the browser instead of the app store. So that way you avoid the costs and the approval times of the app store. Yet you can have something that feels like an app. And with most phones, what you can do is you can just take a website and make it its own little app icon. So you can pretty much make it like an app and bypass the app store. So so check all those out. Those are all great things to learn as you expand, learning things like authentication with JOT tokens, learning how to use different third-party OAuth and other third-party authentication through like Google and whatnot. Learning different deployment services. So watch my video on deployment to find the different deployment services. If you go to my programmer tools video, you'll find a lot of other cool stuff to learn. DevOps, things like Docker, Kubernetes, whatnot. These are all great tools that'll make you a more attractive person in the job market. So I'll see you guys later on. Ciao.